New Zealand is obsessed with timber framing. For the last 100 years, timber frames have made up over 90% of the structural market in new residential building. In this video here, we're going to talk about some of the different materials used for structural framing in New Zealand. We'll talk about the cost considerations of those options, and stick around to the end of the video where we learn why New Zealanders love timber. So obviously you know about timber framing, but some of the other common ways to frame a building here in New Zealand is steel or metal, masonry, and you can even build a house out of rammed earth. Let's jump into it and discuss the different options. First up, steel framing. There's a number of companies here in New Zealand offering steel framing, and it's very similar to timber. You still have studs, dwangs, bottom plates, top plates, sills, lintels, and all of those other components. The steel is either box sections or C-channels, and some of these pictures here show you a cross section of the different steel members. Some of the pros of this is it's very lightweight and strong and stable. Steel is also moisture resistant. It does not absorb water the way that timber or other materials will, and so you don't need to wait for a moisture test to continue the different elements of your build. Sounds great, right? But some of the drawbacks of steel include insulation. You have to add extra layers of insulation to the process. Because steel is a low thermal mass that easily conducts heat, it can cause both heat loss and condensation issues. Not only that, but steel is a good conductor of electricity. So this means your entire framing system needs to be grounded and extra circuit breakers need to be installed. One of the other things with steel is it's harder to manipulate, and much more of the framing system is interlocked. So if it gets damaged or it needs to get changed, there is a bit of work involved with this. And the last bit about steel is that it is prone to rust. So steel frames come out of the factory galvanized, but if it's scratched, drilled, or cut, those ends can be susceptible to rust over time. Majority of builders, myself included, are not used to working with steel, so it is a different set of tools, it's a different process, and so learning this new system can be time consuming and costly. It doesn't mean that it's right or wrong, it just means that for the majority of us builders, we've never worked with steel, so we would be like a fish out of water, not quite sure what to do. If you work with steel, comment below, tell us about your experience, tell us your thoughts on the pros and cons of steel. Some of the cost considerations, according to this report, steel has a higher material cost than timber. Now that might be changing over time, but right now that means that to buy a set of steel frames is slightly more expensive than buying a set of timber frames. And like I touched on before, the majority of builders haven't worked with it, so at least initially labor costs could be higher while the builder gets his or her head around working with steel. However, using steel can be faster and does lead to a more streamlined building process. And the only other cost consideration with steel is that you need additional insulation materials that you wouldn't on a timber frame to deal with the thermal performance. All up, when you balance the overs and the unders, for someone that is doing steel day in, day out, it will be comparable to timber when you include labor and extra materials. If you're obsessed with these videos, go ahead, click subscribe, help us build it up. Let's move on to masonry. Masonry refers to things such as brick, stone, or concrete blocks to form the structure in your house. These materials are typically stacked on top of each other, and you use mortar to hold everything together. Usually there's a bit of steel reinforcing involved behind the scenes as well. Now, brick housing is really popular overseas, and I know is a common system in the UK. They have what's called the double skin brick. Virtually no houses here in New Zealand have that. What is common to see here in New Zealand is a brick veneer, so timber framing on the inside and a brick veneer on the outside. That doesn't mean you can't use masonry to form the structure of your building, but really that has become a mainstay in settings in the industrial and commercial scene, but has not really moved into the residential area. What I have seen a number of times is 200 series blocks. Often we do this if we have to retain a wall, so the back wall of a house could be a masonry block wall. On one side is waterproofing and then the earth, and on the other side is the house. Usually we only use masonry where it's required for a really specific purpose, such as a firewall or a retaining wall, and we'll build the rest of the house out of timber. Some of the pros of masonry is that it's very durable and very stable, and that makes it very strong. They can withstand heavy loads, they can withstand adverse weather effects. It makes them ideal for long-lasting structures. Masonry is fire resistant, and so if you're building a house right on a boundary or an intertenancy wall or in a commercial setting, if there is a fire issue, it makes it very good for containing it on the side of the building and not letting it spread. And masonry offers very good thermal efficiency. It is thicker and denser. It makes it harder for heat to transfer through than other materials such as steel. And this ultimately reduces the need for excessive heating in the final building. Not only is it a good insulation material for heat, but it is good at blocking sound. Whether that's sound leaving the building or sound from the outside coming in, it acts as a good buffer. This is super beneficial if you're in a very busy place, close to a busy road. Super desirable for factories and businesses that need to manage their noise. And on top of that, masonry is low maintenance. Once you have installed it, it requires very little ongoing care. So as you can see, masonry has a lot of benefits. Some of the downfalls: here in New Zealand, we are earthquake prone, and solid masonry structures don't do well in earthquakes unless they've been specifically designed to take that lateral movement. As well as not being great in earthquakes, masonry is prone to cracking and shrinking. And while short term, it doesn't require much maintenance, long term, this will be something you would need to keep on top of to ensure the longevity of your building. Another downfall of masonry is it's very heavy and bulky. It takes up double the space of timber. It's very labor intensive to move around and install. It makes handling a challenge, especially compared to lightweight steel framing. This also means that if you're specializing in masonry, you would need specialized equipment such as mini cranes. It's costly, and it's just an extra process and an extra person you have to involve. So to sum up the cost considerations, masonry is more expensive than timber framing or steel framing, but does have its use. We use it in limited scenarios, mainly for foundations more than framing, but it can be used for firewalls and retaining walls. Have you built a house out of masonry? How did it turn out? Would you do it again? Before we move on to the next structural element, we should touch on a sub-product of masonry, which is tilt panels or insulated concrete panels. Any form of a concrete panel that is formed in a factory, brought to site and stood up. Again, it's a very, very tiny part of the market here. There is one company up in Levin that specializes in building homes that way. It's not a new product, but it's new to the New Zealand market and no one's really doing it. So there's not enough knowledge about the pros and cons, and I suppose just not that market share to give that product momentum. One of the last structural elements I'd like to touch on is rammed earth, and I've seen a few of these houses on Grand Designs. Rammed earth is where you set up big forms or shutters and you go along and you ram the earth in stages. It's a very alternative way of building because you need a ton of labor. Often people have rammed earth parties where you turn up and you spend all day or all weekend learning about rammed earth and basically just giving a lot of labor to the build to get it up out of the ground. Much like all building systems, it still needs a foundation, it still needs reinforcing in the walls, and it still needs engineering around the structure. There'd be a very limited amount of engineers here in New Zealand that would design and sign off that type of building. You work up in layers, you use a special dirt, you use a special mix. The dirt has to have a special moisture content, and you typically add a little bit of cement, usually 5 to 10%, to bind it all together. You would then need to make sure that your layers are getting compacted properly. You take your shutters off, and now you have a finished wall that is the final look. You can give it a final coating to protect it if you need, but people who do this go for it because they want the look and feel of a rammed earth home. Some of the pros is it's a highly sustainable product. You're using natural materials available in your local area, and the waste is just spread back out on site. This eliminates the need for building materials getting shipped around the world and up and down the country. Rammed earth represents one of the highest thermal masses in building due to its density. This means that your house is cool in summer and warm in winter with very little effort needed to keep it that way. And rammed earth is fireproof. This makes them really popular in areas that are prone to wildfires. If your home is in one of these areas, it's more likely to stand the test of time. Because it's a versatile, flexible product, you have the ability to make shapes and styles of houses that you wouldn't be able to make with other products easily. This means you can build something beautiful and unique. On top of that, it's durable and it's low maintenance. Now that we've talked about some of the pros of rammed earth, let's talk about some of the cons. First up, it is susceptible to water damage and is only as good as the roof and drainage system that you install to keep the water off the walls. As well as that, it is a very time-consuming product to install, very labor-intensive. It's something that if you have all the time in the world and you love it, you could do it, but if you're paying people to do it, there are far more economical ways to build a home. There's very limited knowledge in the building code and in the trades, for example, structural engineers that know about rammed earth and know how to get it through the process. I would guess that my local council here has most likely not signed off a rammed earth home here in the last year or two, and if they did have one come across their desk, it would be a very intense process to get it through consent. All of these things make it a more costly process to go through than a traditional structure that's made out of timber or steel. But it doesn't mean that this is a bad option, it just means that everyone knows about these products so they go through the system really easily. Some of the cost considerations is that while the material is really low cost, especially if you're taking it from your own land, but the time involved is expensive if you're paying for it. Something to think about is that going through the process is going to be harder than going through the process for a traditional structure. This could make that more costly. You're most likely going to spend more money on professionals such as engineers to get your building signed off. Ongoing, your maintenance costs of the building will be low, especially if you have designed it to keep water off the building. And a rammed earth home will be energy efficient, meaning you spend less money on power to heat it up. Moving on to timber framing. Just like steel framing, you will build a wall with a bottom plate, studs, a top plate, dwangs. You have sills and lintels above and below your windows. And nowadays, all of that is designed on a computer, built in a factory and delivered to site, ready to be stood. Being a tried and true system here in New Zealand means we don't have to spend heaps of time researching a new methodology and getting our head around it. We're building the same way we've been building for over 100 years now. Here in New Zealand, we are growing pine forests specifically for timber mills to chop down and turn into timber. That does mean that from the point of view of growing the timber specifically to turn into framing, it is a sustainable choice, although the jury is out on the environmental effects of forestry. Being so prevalent, it means that most builders can work with timber. Their tools and skills are mainly focused on timber. They know how to manipulate and adjust it to make it work so that they can build a straight and level building. And that would also expand to your average Kiwi DIYer. It would be the easiest product for them to drill into, cut, change, replace, if they're confident. Timber is a natural insulator. That means it meets the New Zealand code without the need for additional thermal breaks involved in other building methods. As well as that, it has been proven to be a safe product in situations such as earthquakes, and having some flexibility means that in an earthquake it's able to bend rather than break. This means that the buildings are more likely to stand the test of time. Some of the cons of timber: while it is grown sustainably, it's vulnerable to pests and rot. This means that it has to get pumped full of chemicals at the timber mill before it comes to site. You need to be careful of breathing in the dust from it. And on top of that, timber is vulnerable to moisture. It absorbs and attempts to equalize to the environment around it. This means in the middle of winter, we have to seal a building up and do moisture tests and get the moisture content down before we can carry on building. And so for this reason, it can slow down the building process. And on top of this, because timber was a living product, because it was a tree, and even though it's been run through a mill and it's been run through a kiln, it doesn't mean it's not susceptible to movement. And so it's quite common to see expansion and shrinkage and twisting on site, and this can be frustrating as a builder when you go around and you use a string line and a level to make everything mint, and then the building has a mind of its own and starts to move slightly. This, combined with steel roofs, which Kiwis also love, watch this video here, means that's why you sometimes hear the popping, creaking, cracking in houses. That is the subtle movements of a timber house. One of the other downfalls is that timber has a lower lifespan compared to products such as steel or concrete. One of the ways the industry has worked on addressing some of these issues is with products such as LVL, laminated veneer lumber. Basically, it's like plywood. They take strips of timber and glue it together, and then they use this to make studs or dwangs, and they are very strong and very straight and very true. You can make them to specific lengths. It minimizes wastage. It's a new form of timber that incorporates all of the benefits of timber and addresses some of the downfalls. Some of the cost considerations when considering timber: if 90% of the country is doing it, it's for a reason. The whole system is geared up to build houses this way. It does mean that by and large, it's the most cost-effective solution. Most likely your builder's gonna know how to deal with timber. Your suppliers are gonna know that you're building with timber. It is the path of least resistance. This does mean that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy and people continue to use it. So why are Kiwis obsessed with timber framing? The stats are really clear. In the last decade, over 90% of buildings used timber as their structural element. And out of that, 92% of those were made in a pre-nail or pre-cut scenario. Kiwis love pre-nail timber. Some would say they're obsessed. It's important to note how it became this way as well. And there's some speculation that early settlers in the 1860s and 1870s came to New Zealand with dreams of building their own masonry home, much like they would have in Europe. However, despite being susceptible to fire and rot, timber was a far lighter product to move up and down the country. There was a readily available supply of it in the New Zealand forests, and there was a greater ease of construction on site. For these reasons, early New Zealand homes were built with timber, and we've never stopped. I've only just scratched the surface of 4 ways of building a home. I think that there's room to explore things such as masonry and incorporate that into future designs. We really just need the entire system to be more open to different construction methods. If you know a different method or you've got your thoughts on the methods I've talked about, share your comments below. We would love to hear from you.